I never thought a quiet evening in my kitchen would turn into a moment I'd remember for the rest of my life. My son's friend had stayed later than usual, and while I was tidying up, he said something that stopped me in my tracks. It wasn't what I expected to hear. Not from him. Not in that moment. And the way he looked at me, well, that's something I still can't quite put into words, but I'll try. Before I tell you, I want to know, from which city are you watching us tonight? I love reading your comments, and I'm always surprised to see how far our stories travel. It was a Saturday evening in early spring, the kind where the air outside still carried a faint chill, but the smell of blooming magnolias had started to creep through the open windows. My son Daniel had invited Jacob over to watch a game in the living room. They'd been friends since high school, and though they were both in their early 30s now, they still had the easy camaraderie of boys who grew up together. I was in the kitchen rinsing dishes and half listening to their laughter from the other room. Every so often I'd hear Jacob's voice over the television, warm, deep, and a little rough around the edges. He'd always had a way of speaking that made you stop and listen. Around 10 o'clock, Daniel yawned and announced he was heading upstairs to bed. He'd had a long week at work, and I could see it in the slump of his shoulders. Jacob stayed behind, nursing the last of his coffee. "I'll be out in a minute," he told Daniel, and my son just waved him off, disappearing up the stairs. Suddenly, the house felt quieter. The television was still on, but softer now, and the ticking of the wall clock seemed louder than usual. Jacob leaned back on the couch, stretching his long legs out in front of him, and turned his head toward the kitchen. "You always make the best coffee, Olivia," he called out. I laughed, wiping my hands on a towel. "It's just the cheap stuff from the grocery store." "You must be easily impressed." "No," he said, shaking his head slowly. "It's not the coffee. It's, I don't know, something about being here. You make it feel different, warmer." His words caught me off guard. I wasn't used to hearing that kind of thing. Not from one of Daniel's friends. I busied myself by rearranging the dish towel on the counter, trying to ignore the way my cheeks had suddenly warmed. "Jacob, that's a sweet thing to say," I replied, trying to keep my voice light. "But it's late. You should probably head home before the roads get too empty." Instead of standing up, he slowly rose from the couch and stepped into the kitchen. The light above the sink cast a gentle glow on his face, softening his features. I noticed things I hadn't really paid attention to before. The faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his hair curled slightly at the back of his neck. He leaned against the counter, not too close, but close enough that I could smell the faint mix of coffee and something woodsy on his jacket. "You know," he began, his voice quieter now, "I've been meaning to tell you something for a while. I just never found the right time." I sat down the mug I'd been holding. My curiosity piqued. "What is it?" His eyes held mine, steady and unflinching. "You've been more of a comfort to me than you realize. More than most people in my life, actually." The sincerity in his voice was disarming. This wasn't some offhand comment or polite thank you. It was something deeper. "Jacob," I said softly, unsure of where to take the conversation. He smiled faintly, but there was something bittersweet in it. "I know it might sound strange, but being here talking to you, even just sitting in this kitchen, it's helped me in ways I can't explain." I felt an ache in my chest, the kind that comes when you realize someone's been carrying a quiet weight. I thought of the times he'd been over, laughing with Daniel, always polite to me, never showing a hint of trouble. Yet here he was, letting me see past that easy smile. I reached for the coffee pot, more to give my hand something to do than anything else. "Do you want a refill?" I asked gently. He chuckled. "Sure, as long as you're the one pouring it." We sat at the small kitchen table, the same table I'd had for over 20 years. It had its share of scratches and worn edges, but it was sturdy, dependable. I couldn't help thinking the same could be said about me. For the next hour we really talked about his work, his family, the things he missed from his childhood. I found myself opening up too about the quietness of the house since Daniel had moved out years ago, about how I sometimes cooked too much dinner just to feel like I was feeding a family again. At one point, he reached across the table, his fingers brushing the back of my hand. It was a light touch, almost hesitant, but it lingered just long enough to make me notice. I met his eyes, and for a moment neither of us said a word. The clock ticked, the coffee steamed, and outside the magnolia blossoms swayed in the night breeze. It wasn't a romantic gesture, not exactly, but it was charged with something unspoken, A kind of mutual understanding that neither of us had expected to find that night. When he finally stood to leave, I walked him to the door. He paused before stepping out, his hand on the door knob. "Thank you, Olivia," he said simply. "For tonight." I smiled, my heart still carrying the weight of our conversation. "Anytime, Jacob." And then he was gone, his figure disappearing down the dimly lit street, leaving me alone with the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the lingering warmth of his words. I didn't know it then, but that night would be the start of something neither of us could have predicted. The next morning, the kitchen felt like a stage after the audience had gone home. Quiet, a little messy, and filled with echoes from the night before. I rinsed the coffee pot and wondered whether Jacob's words would fade with the steam or settle into the corners of the room the way certain memories do, waiting to be dusted every so often. I told myself not to read into it. I told myself a lot of things while I wiped the table twice and rearranged the fruit bowl like it might answer back. Before noon, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "It's Jacob. Thanks again for last night. Your kitchen is good company." I smiled despite myself. He added, "If you're around later, I can stop by to bring back that travel mug I accidentally took." A minute later, a winking emoji appeared as if he wanted to acknowledge the small pretense of needing a reason. I told him he was welcome to swing by, though there was no rush. Then I made a pot of vegetable soup, the kind you can't quite mess up, the kind that fills the house with a warmth that has very little to do with temperature. I set out bowls as if expecting two, and then scolded myself and put one back. Old habits die stubbornly. He arrived in the late afternoon, hands in his jacket pockets, hair still a little damp from the drizzle that had begun to tap against the windows. He set the mug on the counter and offered to help slice carrots. I handed him a cutting board and watched as he moved around my kitchen like someone who'd practiced in silence, turning the knife in his hand, carefully peeking at the spice rack, asking where I kept the ladle. There is a kind of intimacy in ordinary help. It is not romantic in the way people write songs about, but it is tender in the way we live our days. "Daniel told me you've been thinking about repainting the living room," he said, sliding the carrots into the pot. "If you need a spare pair of hands, I'm pretty decent with a roller." "Decent with a roller," I repeated, amused. "That's a rare skill set." He laughed, then sobered. "I meant what I said last night, Olivia. About this house, about you. Feels easier here." I stirred the soup, letting the steam blur my vision for a breath longer than necessary. "Easier is a gift most of us don't recognize until it's gone," I said. "If I can offer that, I'm glad." We ate with the calm of people who've learned to respect hunger and quiet in equal measure. He told me a little more about his mother, how she taught him that gentleness is not an apology but a choice, and how losing her had made certain rooms feel colder. I told him how I missed the days when Daniel was small and his sneakers squeaked across the tile when the house was noisy in all the right ways. We weren't trading sorrows. We were building a porch for them to sit on together. Before he left, he glanced toward the living room doorway where the paint was indeed chipping. "Saturday," he asked. "If you're free, I'll bring the drop cloth and a playlist with nothing too loud." I pretended to consider it, even though my heart had already said yes. Saturday works. That week moved like a long exhale. I worked my way through the closets I'd been meaning to organize. I found a box of old photo frames, a scarf I thought I'd lost, a handful of receipts that told the small story of an ordinary life. Milk, batteries, birthday candles. Each little thing reminded me I had been keeping this ship afloat for a long time. I felt a steadiness return, like a familiar song discovered on a forgotten radio station. Saturday came washed in sun after a night of rain. He arrived early, sleeves rolled, a couple of paint samples in hand. We settled on a warm shade that looked like late afternoon, something that would be kind to the light in winter. We taped and edged and rolled, speaking in the generous pauses of people who don't fear silence. When our arms burned, we rested on the drop cloth and ate sandwiches balanced on paper towels. He told me about a mentor who'd once told him the bravest thing a man can do is not to fix everything, but to stay present with what can't be fixed. I told him about the time I thought my life would look one way forever and how it didn't. A story I realized as I spoke that didn't bruise the way it used to. At some point, phones buzzed. Daniel's name lit my screen. He wanted to know whether Jacob had left his jacket at my house the other night. I told him no and that we were painting today. There was a pause before the three little dots appeared. "You and Jacob," he wrote. Then that's unexpected. I stared at the message, the word unexpected, asking all the questions he wasn't ready to ask. Jacob caught my expression. Everything all right? Daniel's curious, I said. It hadn't occurred to me that my home might not feel like my own once a friend is involved. Jacob set his roller down carefully. We can stop, he offered. We can figure out the right way to do this. I couldn't want to make anything complicated. And there it was, the line we would either cross sloppily or approach with care. I breathed out and typed to Daniel. We're just fixing up the living room. You know, I've been meaning to. Want to come by later and see? A simple invitation. Daylight clear. He replied with a thumbs up, and I felt the ground tilt back to level. In the late afternoon, when the last coat had been smoothed, and the room glowed like a warm promise, we stood in the doorway together and admired our work. The scent of paint mingled with the faint sweetness drifting from the magnolia tree outside. I picked up a framed picture of Daniel at 12, front teeth too big for his grin, pride bursting at the seams with his first baseball trophy. I placed it on the shelf and noticed the bracket wobble. That shelf has been off for months, I said. I've got it, Jacob replied and went to the garage to hunt for a screwdriver like he'd lived here long enough to know where things hide. He tightened the bracket with a quiet focus that made me study him the way one studies a landscape, taking in both what's obvious and what's quiet. When he finished, he didn't step back right away. He looked at the photograph and then at me. You've been holding this place together a long time, he said, his voice steady. If you ever want help, not a rescue, not a fix, just a second pair of hands, a second heart noticing the same room. It'd like to be that. The words were not grand, not the kind you see printed on greeting cards. They were better than that. They were specific. They fit the moment like a key that had been filed slowly until it turned smoothly in the lock. I felt something shift, a small seismic adjustment inside the neat arrangement of my life. Not an earthquake, a settling. I found myself standing closer than before, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his eyes. Thank you for saying that, I replied. I don't know the rules for this. We can write them, he said softly. We can write them in pencil and change them if we need to. A car door slammed outside. Daniel, I felt a pinch of nerves and a swell of love for the boy who had once lined up toy cars along this very baseboard. He came in with that half-smile adults wear when they're trying out grown-up reactions. Well, I'll be, he said, taking in the room. You two did some real work. He looked between us, not suspicious so much as alert to the way new furniture changes the familiar map of a room. Grab a brush, I teased, pointing to a mist edge near the vent. He laughed and joined in, careful, precise, my boy, who'd grown into a man who liked his corners neat. We spent an hour together, three people linked by a house that had seen all of our versions. The conversation floated on football scores, grocery deals, mutual friends, the everyday rope that keeps a family tied to its dock. When Daniel left, work in the morning, he paused at the door. Ma, he said, you look good. Happy even the room suits you. After he drove off, the evening came down in a long mellow stretch of light. Jacob and I sat on the couch without turning on the TV. The new paint made shadows look like soft brush strokes. I wrapped my hands around a cup of tea and listened to the birds lay down the last notes of the day. I don't want to hurry this, he said, eyes on the window. But I also don't want to pretend I don't feel it. You matter to me, Olivia. Not because you make great coffee or soup, though you do. Not because your house is warm, though it is. Because when I talk to you, I don't feel like I have to perform. I don't feel judged. I feel seen. That's not something I can ignore. My heart thudded once, then found a rhythm that made sense. I set the cup down and folded my hands in my lap like I do when I want to speak carefully. You matter to me too, I said. But I need us to keep this rooted in respect. Respect for Daniel, for ourselves, for the years that brought us to this room. I gave a small wry smile and for fresh paint. He laughed, agreed. We start with slow. We start with ordinary walks, dinners, conversations. We keep each other honest. We keep each other honest. I echoed. We plan to walk for Sunday. The arboretum on the edge of town where the paths curve, as if in conversation with your footsteps. He texted me that night to say he'd bring an umbrella just in case. I fell asleep thinking about all the just-in-case items I'd carried alone for years, and how oddly nice it felt to picture a second umbrella in the hall. Sunday brought the cautious sun that follows a weekend of rain. The arboretum smelled like earth and new leaves. Families pushed strollers, and older couples moved with the practiced ease of people who've learned to match their steps. We took the long path that circles the pond. A blue heron stood in the shallows, a statue that occasionally decided to lift its wings and prove the world wrong. We talked about small things that revealed larger truths. The grocery store clerk who knows when to ask about your day, and when to just bag the potatoes the way certain songs feel like seasons. He told me he'd been offered a promotion that would come with more hours and less of what he loves about his work. He was leaning toward no but needed to practice saying it out loud. I told him about a book club I'd been invited to join, but had hesitated about. I worried I might not have the energy for new people. He said, "You don't owe anyone your energy, but you might gift it to yourself." I tucked the sentence in my pocket for later. On a bench near the water, he reached for my hand and stopped, hovering just above my knuckles. The pause was not uncertainty. It was an invitation. "May I?" he asked. "You may," I answered, and felt the simple warmth of his palm slide into mine. A small ceremony performed without witnesses and needing none. We sat like that as the clouds drifted, and the heron decided finally to take off, slow and regal, as if demonstrating the distance between caution and flight. We did not make promises we couldn't keep, or pull the future toward us before it was ready. We named what we were, two people choosing kindness and care, pencil-written rules we could revise but wouldn't betray. On the way back to the car, rain began to flicker through the trees. He opened the umbrella without haste, and we walked a little closer, the sound of drops making a soft percussion above us. At the gate we paused. "What now?" he asked, not to corner me, but to keep us from drifting. "Now," I said. "We go home. You'll text me when you get there so I know you're safe. On Wednesday, you'll come over and I'll teach you how to make the soup without overcooking the green beans. Next weekend, we'll see a matinee and complain about the popcorn. We'll let the paint cure and the room decide where the furniture wants to live. And we'll tell the truth if something feels off." He grinned, relief writing itself across his face. That sounds like more than enough. That night, after he texted a photo of his front steps slick with rain and a caption that said, "Home," I stood in my living room and turned off each lamp one by one. The new paint held the last light with a patience I recognized. I thought about the long years I had learned, unglamorous and brave, how to be good company to myself. I thought about how unexpected it was, and how honest to admit I might be ready for good company, period. At the window, the magnolia trees shivered in a breeze, pale petals clinging and letting go in their own time. I whispered a thank you to the room, to the day, to the ordinary courage that lets a person say yes to a walk, yes to a hand, yes to the idea that tenderness is not a firework, but a lamp you can turn on when the evening arrives. I didn't know what Chapter 3 of my life would hold, but I knew Chapter 2 had asked me kindly to stop editing out my wants. Before I went to bed, I sent Jacob one last message. Pencil and eraser on the table. "See you Wednesday." He replied with a single word that made me smile into the dark. "Understood." And with that, I slept easier than I had in a long time. My house no less my own, my future no less mine, and my heart steady as a clock, newly grateful for the sound it.